Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, also known as the P5+1, failed to reach an agreement with Iran on its nuclear aspirations. The parties involved in the negotiations, however, have decided to continue negotiations for 7 months with a new set deadline on the 30th of June. With us in the studio to discuss the developments are Professor Gerald Steinberg, who is an expert on political science from Bar-Ilan University. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
And I'd like also to welcome Mr. Eliezer Tzafrir, the former head of the Mossad operations in Iran and currently an affiliate with the Institute for Counterterrorism at the IDC in Herzliya. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst on Iran, Dr. Eldad Pardo. Welcome. And I'd like to start with a question to you, Eldad, with regarding to the current situation. What can you fill us in?
Well, from the Iranian point of view, any agreement is extremely difficult because what the Iranians, and when I say Iranians, I mean the Supreme Leader Khamenei, are afraid of is to become the second Shah regime, to serve as an American agent in the Middle East and to try to defend American interests. And that's why it's extremely difficult for them to reach an agreement. The best idea, the best policy for them, is, as I read it, is to have some sanctions forever, an atmosphere of tension, and then, but you know, kind of sanctions that don't hurt too much, which allows them to continue with the nuclear program and with their largely responsible policy across the Middle East. This is how things are seen from Iran. I have to mention one thing. Khamenei explained that these negotiations is similar to what is known in Arabic as the Sulh Hassan wa Muawiyah, which is the peace between Imam Hassan and Muawiyah, which is basically a peace with the enemy to gain time until the situation is improving. And definitely what we see today is a success of this policy of Khamenei. Of course, Rouhani and other people in Iran have other opinions, but on the other hand, there are also different factions.
Mr. Tzafrir, how do you see this?
Well, knowing the Iranians, in my opinion, the main object of Iran's regime today is to reach the capacity of nuclear power. And what they are doing along these years is trying to use the principle of khuda, from the Arabic word khuda, which means the way to deceive the others, to deceive the whole world in order to gain time, more time, as much as possible, to reach the goal. They know that they have some places to compromise. They suffer very much from the sanctions, but still they are, in my opinion, they are sticking to this policy to reach nuclear power.
Professor Steinberg, we hear many experts also here in the studio with regarding to the Iranian aspirations and their will and ability to gain as much as possible time to reach a certain objective, whether it is, of course, Israel's concern with regarding to achieving nuclear capabilities. What happens in the West? Where does the West stand on this?
First of all, the ongoing negotiations are a total failure for the P5+1, mainly the United States, the European Union, plus Germany, that framework. The Russians and Chinese are there, and they are largely looking out for their own interests, but they're not key players. The West has agreed. This is the second series. Started back in 2003, European-led negotiations, which Rouhani, the same leader now, then head of the nuclear program, was able to stretch out, just constant negotiations. And they've done the same thing now, where I think the third round, the second extension, Iran continues to produce enriched fuel, enriched uranium. It continues to work on its program. It does not reveal, despite the interim agreement that was reached, they are not revealing many of the details of their program, which are a violation of international law and their treaty commitments. So basically, Iran is allowed, the punishment is being reduced. The sanctions that were put on have been slowly reduced. I think it's $5 billion a month is being released, so that eases to some degree their economic pain, and they're giving up almost nothing for that. So this is a colossal negotiation failure.
The interim agreement, which was reached in November of 2013, specifies within the JPOA, which is the joint planning program of action. Within this agreement, there was specified specifically that Iran would have to work directly with the IAEA in a bid to improve the transparency and to lower the enrichment capabilities, something that, according to U.S. Secretary of State, is still in effect also in this specific extension. However, during this time period of 1 year, this has been stated by the IAEA, which they're nowhere. They're not even close to achieving the goals of the interim agreement. So how can they actually reach a full agreement?
Well, there's a big disagreement, and I think that's where the Israeli position, Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli defense establishment strongly disagree, not only in terms of the analysis of the goals and the role of Iran in this and stretching it out, but on the details. The Israeli position, which is the IAEA position essentially, IAEA position, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is monitoring the compliance of Iran with its undertaking, said they have not revealed a number, not only have they not revealed, they refused access to a number of sites which were covered under the JPOA and under the interim agreement. And that's become very, very blatant, and they tried to cover up some of the areas, Parchin and elsewhere. They're not allowing inspection, and the IAEA just reported on that. On the other hand, and Kerry can say, yes, but they have apparently, according to all the indications, stopped their high enriched uranium processes, which was also part. So Kerry can say it's half full, and Israel can say it's half empty. They're certainly not complying with all of the terms, and then I think that's also the West fooling itself by saying, well, it's good enough for us to continue. They really want to believe that this is going to go through.
I would like to ask you, Mr. Tzafir, with regarding to the sanctions. How are they truly devastating the Iranian economy? And in a sense, currently Congress in the United States is publicly stating that there somehow are moving forward new sanctions, and something that of course will be vetoed by the American president and the administration. But how will Iran react to new sanctions if they will be imposed, and how is this dynamic currently standing?
Well, I think that the sanctions do the job in a way. In my opinion, there is a need for the American Congress to put on further sanctions until Iran will understand that she has to comply with the request of the West. It is very important. In my opinion, I agree with what Professor Steinberg said, that it is anyway a failure of the West. You can even compare it to the complete failure of the West headed by United States of America regarding North Korea. So, I mean, there is not very much to say about it, because it is sure the Iranians are smart enough to continue with deceiving the whole world in order to keep as much as possible. Indeed, the sanctions made a sort of a gap between the group of Rouhani and Rafsanjani versus Khamenei. But after all, Khamenei with the Republican, with the Jumhuriyet Guard in Iran, they make the decisions.
So there is some kind of disagreement within Iran with this regard.
Yes.
All right. Professor Dr. Pardo, with regarding to the current situation on the sanctions, the United States has been very open about the point where the sanctions which were imposed on Iran are the reason for the situation to be where it is today, and being able to sit with some kind of leverage for the negotiations, specifically the sanctions from the American Central Bank. Do you believe that the United States is somehow trying to get to a point where it just is looking for an agreement other than moving forward?
Well, I hope not. I think there is one point that is not discussed enough, and this is the issue of containment. That they are civilized guys. Let them have this nuclear deterrence, and well, we had the Cold War, and all this is fine. But there are a lot of flaws, not just one. One problem is civilized peoples, like the German ones, who are extremely connected with the Iranians, can do horrible things and can behave in a horrible manner. So the fact that somebody speaks good English doesn't mean anything. Some people don't speak good English and they are good people. So that's one thing. On top of that, there is this idea of mystic thinking that is taught across Iranian school education. They say, well, the West, they work in a limited manner. They think only rational, which is good. We do this also. We do science. But there are other things. And other things are Sharia, which is legal, religious law, but there is also mystic thinking and emotional thinking. So this would be fine. Okay, you do some meditation, it's good, fine. But then it tells you, but you have to obey blindly the leader. And the leader can issue new edicts regarding weapons every day. And this is in school, they learn it, and they do exercise how to protect themselves against nuclear attack. On top of that, there was a research coming actually from Herzliya about the mechanisms of containment, which is a complicated. I for one believe that the fact that we didn't have a nuclear war during the Cold War we are very lucky, but it doesn't say anything because nothing repeats itself, and it may be a sheer coincidence. But the combination of religiosity, and particularly with Shiite Islam, that has this ambition and fundamentalist interpretation that includes building this jihad, taking over the Islamic world, and continuing. Just to understand what does it mean, fundamentalist interpretation of the religion. I'm not speaking about Islam, I'm speaking about particular interpretation. 2 months ago in Iran, a guy named Mohsen Amir Aslani was executed because he argued that the fact that Jonah was in the belly of the whale and came out alive is impossible. This means that this is a metaphoric. He's a religious Muslim person, says this is a metaphoric interpretation. He was executed after being 8 years in prison because he dared shed doubt. So this is the regime. They hang people by the dozens, and they stone and all this. So they are very dangerous, and they should not have nuclear weapons.
One moment, I would like to actually ask Professor Steinberg with regarding to what we just heard from Dr. Pardo. Do you believe that these sanctions truly got us where we are today, and is there a certain scenario in which we can get to a new reality in which the Americans will try and loosen the sanctions in order to garner some kind of breakthrough within the negotiations?
First of all, it's not just about Americans. Europeans are full partners in this. And very often Europe will take the lead, for good or for bad. They will take the lead in pushing for concessions vis-a-vis Iran, and in some cases for increasing sanctions. It's been both ways. And so when sanctions are dropped, it's got to be either with European pressure or European cooperation, or if they're raised or they're maintained. Europe is a full partner in this. Each member of the European Union it plays a significant role, and the body together plays a very significant role. And here I think the issue is very clear. Sanctions clearly brought Iran to the table, and their goal in these negotiations are to have their cake and eat it too, to maintain the nuclear weapons program with all the implications. And we're talking about nuclear weapons, we're talking about mass destruction. We're talking about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's what they're seeking. This is an organization that, as we've just heard from Dr. Pardo, hangs people who are considered to be blasphemous and supports terrorist groups like Hezbollah and provides weapons to Hamas and other organizations in the region and around the world. It's for them to have nuclear weapons is a very, very serious problem. So sanctions brought them to the table, but their goal is to get as much of those sanctions lifted without giving up the nuclear goal. And the West, as I said earlier, has failed in trying to manage these negotiations so that they get something more serious, something that the Iranians are forced to give up in order to maintain some sort of economic lifeline. They missed the opportunity when they started the negotiations, and they missed it again now, because they could have said full sanctions are being restored until you meet your basic requirements. They're just being strung along instead.
Mr. Safran?
I would like to add a point regarding to what Dr. Pardo was speaking about, regarding the emotional motive of the Iranians. It is known already for quite a few years that the majority of the Iranian people are young men and young women who were born during the revolution or after it. Most of them, they want a radical change back to sanity, for sure. But if you look upon the Iranian emotional side at all, there is a kind of megalomany feeling of the Iranians as a big power in the world, historical, which is correct. And if you ask most of the Iranians, even the majority, maybe 75 or 80% who are against the regime, but they are still pro-nuclear power because they are pro-Iran as a big power in the area.
Dr. Pardo, your comment on this?
Yeah, there are some undercurrents, changes in Iran in recent years. One of them is they go back to the Aryan roots, and they go back to talking about ancient empires. So they have this vision of building a new empire that has a racist ideology in the center. The Aryans are supposed to lead the other stupid Muslims and Arabs and build this new empire. They have particular strong superiority vision of them as the Aryan people, and this is something that is not discussed enough, but it is widespread. And then there is
this is what scares the Sunnis.
Yeah, and then there is two other dangers of Iran having nuclear weapons that is also not discussed enough. One of them is a combination of cyber war and nuclear weapons. Iran invests a lot of energy and effort into the cyber war field, partly because they were also probably attacked. But one has to remember that, people say, okay, they will have a few bombs, the US has, many more, so what's the deal? But it's not the deal. They can combine a cyber attack and make the Americans, shut down the program for a few days, and then you cannot know in this new world, the combination of cyber war and nuclear war is extremely dangerous. Another dimension that is not discussed, and we heard from Mr. Tzafrir here, the inside situation in Iran is very fragile. The regime is far from being stable. It's not only the sanctions that brought them to the table, but also the 2009 protest movement, the ethnic groups, the unrest, and all that. So there is a veritable danger of implosion. What happens if Iran have nuclear weapons and they implode inside? And then you have some people from Revolutionary Guards or whoever having these nuclear weapons, and there is no regime to control this. What is the difference between Iran, Iraq, and Syria? Iraq and Syria, these two catastrophes, and also the problem in Bahrain and in Yemen, all of these were made by Iran. The Americans won the 8-year war in Iraq. There was a beautiful Iraq, democratic, exporting oil, and then they asked the Iranians to help them, and they gave it to Iran to manage. What do we have there? We have ISIS. Same thing in Syria. You had peaceful protests, and what happens? What happens? The Iranians told them, shoot these peaceful demonstrators, everything will be okay. Well, we see what it is. So they are a failure. It's a failure state, and you want to give them nuclear weapons. It's a recipe for a disaster to happen.
Professor Steinberg, I would like to move on to the negotiations, the extension. There came to some kind of understanding with regarding to the 7 months with a 4-month political extension, which according to U.S. Secretary of State Kerry, this extension is to see where they're standing and try to reach a deal. And then if these 4 months, in the month of March, will come to a certain understanding and see that they're going somewhere, they'll have an extension of another 3 months with a deadline on the 30th of June, what will happen then? Will there be another extension if this doesn't work out? How does this work?
We've already reached the point of absurdity, so now it's going to be extra absurdity. And the details, we're negotiating about negotiations. 4 months and then 3 months, and there are going to be constant debates about Iranian compliance and about lifting of sanctions. This is more about the process. The Iranians want a process. The process gives them sanctions relief. It brings trade fairs from Germany, from other countries, and the beginning of economic revival. And then, of course, the Russians, the Chinese are rushing in there because they say, well, the West is already doing this. So they see sanctions regime as collapsing. Despite the declarations of President Obama, they see the Americans and the Europeans as weak. All of this is about extending the negotiations as long as possible on terms that benefit the Iranians. So on the American side, and certainly on the European side, it's very much being in love with the process. We need to engage. We need to understand those with whom we have differences. We need to avoid violence and bloodshed. That's the mantra that we hear both from Europe and now from the Obama administration. So everybody together is happy with an ongoing process from a limited perspective. I don't see the United States and Europe taking the actions necessary to deter the Iranians, to make them recognize, which they don't have to if it's not going to be the reality, but to have them say, wait a minute, maybe this is too costly for us. I want to raise one other scenario, which is something that I think needs to be kept in mind during this being in love with negotiations that takes place. We had a war between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006. Hezbollah attacked Israel, killed soldiers, stole some bodies, then missiles were thrown back and forth, and for a number of weeks, for 6 weeks, we had a war. If during that very, very difficult war, where there were attacks on Lebanon and responses in Haifa and elsewhere with missiles, if Iran had nuclear weapons, and Iran was the patron of Nasrallah and Hezbollah and the entire terrorist movement, and the Iranians started to say, or Hezbollah was in trouble and said, we want your protection, and the Iranians started to invoke the nuclear power, we would be in a situation like the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis, except that then the Russians and the Americans had embassies in each other's countries. We don't have that here. We don't have any kind of means of communication between Iran and Jerusalem, between decision makers in Israel. And in fact, what we know is that the Iranians have very little understanding, just as Hezbollah and Nasrallah, about Israeli red lines. That's a recipe for disaster. Add nuclear weapons to that, and something that Europe and the United States, if they are responsible powers in the world, have to take into account. These red lines have to be maintained, or we're going to see a very much more unstable and violent world.
Right. Mr. Tzafriu?
Regarding future scenarios and Israeli position, I would like to add.
Please.
Some people say, look, the Iranians are not stupid. They know what will happen to them if they will come and they will throw an atom bomb on Israel. Maybe this is correct. The Iranians are not stupid. In contrary, they are very smart. But do we have the luxury to give it a first try? The answer is clear. In my opinion, there is a red line from Israeli point of view that should be decided by professionals, physicians, physical researchers, and intelligence, that Israel cannot permit it go on anymore such game of negotiations of gaining time by the Iranians.
Even though Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, stated in an interview to the BBC that he is happy about the extension of the negotiations in this constellation. Why is that?
I mean, the extension is much better than a wrong agreement. Right. So we were on the verge of wrong agreement. And the extension gives more time to try to convince the other parties to get
to the point.
There's one other point that was made, not by Mr. Netanyahu, but by other people in the government. The term, all options are on the table.
Right.
And that means that Israel still maintains the possibility of a military option. Much harder to do during that first period of negotiations. Now, if Israel says there are no real options for ending the Iranian program through a negotiated agreement, then the military possibility becomes a real one again, with all the difficulties that entails.
We're about to finish the program, so I would like to start with you, Dr. Pardo, with regarding to your future anticipation. What can we expect in the near future?
Iran is, I think that there is a genuine debate inside Iran. And the way to help Iran gradually change course and go back to sanity is to keep the pressure on and make sure that words have meaning, and that there is a lot of energy and effort that should be invested for the future of Iran with this regime or another regime. But if they are allowed to have these nuclear toys, it's really a disaster waiting to happen. Waiting to happen.
Professor Steinberg, with your expectations for the near future?
There is a Republican Senate now coming in January. Mr. Obama is actually weaker than he was. It's possible that the Senate will impose sanctions, and that will actually trigger from Iran a more serious negotiation stance. They may, in fact, implement what they promised to, and because they'll have to. That's something I think that we'll see developing as a possibility in the next few months.
Any change in the European field?
Well, I think the Europeans, certainly the European Union, follows the American lead on this right now. So I think if the Americans show some leadership, then Europe will not stand in their way, and Russia and China will probably also, with some noise, also agree to that.
Mr. Tzafrir?
I would like, on my part, I would like to see the American Congress and the Senate doing what the world are expecting them to do regarding Iran. And let's not forget that we are in the same front line in this concern, together with the Sunni countries, mainly by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and so on.
Do you see some kind of communication between Israel and other Sunni countries in the region?
Much more than see it.
Much more than see it. Yeah. All right. I would like to thank you very much, Professor Steinberg, for coming here. Mr. Tzafrir, it's been a pleasure. Dr. Pardo, it's truly been a pleasure, and I'm sure that we'll see in the near future new developments which we'll be able to continue to discuss. Thank you very much. I'd like also to thank our viewers at home, and we will see you next time.